Welcome everyone to our webinar on what makes a great supported independent living provider. My name is Astrid and I am a senior lawyer in LegalVision's commercial and regulatory team. I am joined today by Nicole from MyCareSpace. Nicole, can you please tell us a bit about yourself and MyCareSpace?
Okay, thanks Astrid. And I first, before I introduce myself, I'd just like to thank our legal partner, LegalVision, for inviting us to partner on this webinar on a very important topic. So good morning, everyone. As Astrid said, my name is Nicole Gamerov, and I am the CEO and founder of MyCareSpace. A little bit about me. First of all, my background is actually in the finance sector, but many years ago, my mum lost her vision to macular degeneration. And at the time, I decided that I wanted to leave my career in finance and get involved in the disability sector. And fast forward 7 years, so we started MyCareSpace 7 years ago after mum was struggling to find supports and services. And fast forward 7 years, MyCareSpace is now supporting thousands of people living with a disability and service providers by connecting them to each other and by connecting them with NDIS information. So look forward to discussing this very important topic with you, and there'll be more information at the end about how to connect specifically with MyCareSpace and our team. Over to you, Astrid.
Thanks, Nicole, for telling us all about yourself and your story. Before we begin, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. You'll receive the recording and slides in your email. You can also submit your questions if you haven't already done so in the chat box, and we'll answer them at the end. We also ask that you please complete the feedback survey after the webinar. Also, you'll all receive are eligible to receive a free consultation with us to discuss how we can help you with your NDIS contracts or any of your legal needs. To request your free consultation, please provide us with your contact details in the survey that appears at the end of the webinar. You can also contact Nicole through MyCareSpace if you would like to discuss how she can help your business. I think Nicole will now start and tell us a little bit about what supported independent living is and give you an overview of our webinar.
Great, and I think there's a slide that actually prompts some of that. But I think for those of you that that don't know what SIL is, it stands for Supported Independent Living. So if you can just move to the next slide. SIL is a form of NDIS support, and under the new payment system PACE, it will be called Home and Living and not under Core. So participants who are usually funded for SIL are those that have complex needs. So if you are thinking about delivering SIL, looking at this as a new service, that is a very, very important factor to consider, because if you've never worked with people with complex needs, this is something that needs to be factored in. So SIL can be delivered in a variety of different ways. First of all, in a participant's own home. Secondly, in a group or shared home. And then it can also be delivered in partnership with specialist disability accommodation, or SDA. So just to clarify, this webinar today, we're not going to be covering ILO, independent living arrangements, or SDA, specialist disability accommodation, although they do potentially interface or there might be some similarities. So in terms of successful SIL delivery, we will discuss this at the end, but I think the key point I would like to make, and from working MyCareSpace, working with thousands of providers, is one of the key observations is that delivering successful SIL requires a wide range of skills. And hopefully by the end of our webinar today, you'll be able to answer the question, do I have these skills? So back over to you, Astrid.
Nicole, I'm going to focus right now on the legal considerations that you need to deliver SIL successfully, and Nicole will go through the business considerations after I finish. If you're doing a SIL in your basically in a group home or where you have more than one participant, you have to consider the leasing considerations. If you are leasing the property from a landlord, do you have the right to sublease the property? Do you have the right to run a business through that property that you have leased? So seeking advice on the lease you have signed, if you have signed a lease, is crucial. Then secondly, you also have to have an occupancy, a boarding or lodging, or a tenancy agreement with the participants that you're putting in the house. As you know, the SIL funding only covers the services that you provide, not the rent, board, lodging, utilities, or food. These are usually done in a separate agreement. So the way we recommend doing it is have your leasing documents done, and this will vary from state to state. And not only will it vary from state to state, it will also vary depending on the number of participants you have in the house. Some states require, if there's more than 3 or 4 participants, that you register as a boarding house or a rooming house. Some states require that if you only have 1 participant, that they're considered a tenant. Getting those documents right will minimize disputes, but also let you know your rights if there are any issues that happen during the SIL agreement and that you have to terminate and ask the participant to move out. So in addition to making sure you have your leasing and rooming agreements done, you then have to also have service agreements. Service agreements, though I've seen in a couple of your questions that they're not mandated by the NDIS. That is true. However, a service agreement, if you're claiming GST free supplies, may be required by the ATO in order to be GST free. It is also recommended that you have a service agreement that will clearly set out your obligations, the participants' obligations, what happens if there's a dispute, either between yourself and the participant, or if you have more than 1 participant in the house, between the participants. Other really important clauses would be your invoicing. Are you invoicing hourly? Are you invoicing weekly? Do you have a provision that allows you to index the price if there are changes to the price guide? What is the ratio of support you're providing? Is it 1:3, 1:4? What are the house rules? What happens if there's a vacancy in the house? What happens if the person who's the participant wants to stay in the house but doesn't want you to provide them with the services? So those are all things that we see happen a lot during disputes if they haven't got a strong agreement that has been set up from the start. It is also important, if you're providing both SDA and the SIL component, that you disclose the conflict of interest. Next slide, please.
And Astrid, I guess from a MyCareSpace perspective, when we do work with providers, we actually ask them, one of the things we ask them if they want to advertise SIL on our platform is, do you have a service agreement? And I think it's a red flag for us if providers don't have a service agreement with those considerations you've just mentioned.
Indeed, Nicole, and we do see that all the time when we have providers come to us that are having some issues with the participants, that we can't go back and say, but what did you agree to? Because there was nothing written down at the time. So that is, in minimizing your risk, having a good service agreement is very important. But Nicole will go through risk minimization down the track. Other things you will need to take into account is, now you've got your house, you have your participants. What do you do? How do you find the staff? Nicole will tell you how to find the staff from like a practical perspective. But I'm going to touch on subcontracting. If you're using subcontractors to staff your houses and provide supports, you will need to ensure that you have robust subcontractor agreements in place that will set out the obligations of the subcontractor, any KPIs that they have to meet. They also need to make sure that they have provided their staff with the required training or experience. Let's not forget that SIL is with complex participants. So they may have hoists, peg tubes, complex behaviors. There may be PBSBs in place. So you have to know your participant and to make sure that the subcontractors that you use have the required training, because you will remain liable for anything that happens when you use subcontractors. So a subcontracting agreement should set out all those obligations, but as well provide for handover notes, privacy obligations. How do they keep the privacy of the participants? What information do they share? And you should also consider their insurance and having some indemnities built into the subcontracting agreement. Which leads me into privacy. Privacy is obviously something that a lot of participants are concerned about, especially when they live in a SIL home. Their own privacy, but the privacy of their information and also their dignity of risk. When you are setting up your business, you should be sure that both yourself and your staff understand the basic privacy principles, but also that you have policies in place guiding your staff on what they have to do. For example, what do you do if a staff member has taken a photo of a wound and sent it to a wound management nurse? Is that a privacy issue? What do you do with the health records that you have? And again, on top of the general privacy obligations, you may also have additional obligations at the state level. In Victoria, for example, most disability providers would also be seen as a health provider and have to comply with the Health Records Act. And then we will then move on to dispute resolution. We do see a fair bit of issues in SIL, whether it's with the NDIS Commission issuing breach notices, which we have seen a lot of increase in the past 3 weeks, but also with participants causing damage to the house, where you want to evict a participant, but you may not be able to because it's not written in your service agreement, or they are a tenant and you can't. Or in some states, they have protections because you cannot evict them if they're causing damage due to their disability. Having an internal and client-facing complaints process will minimize the disputes and save you money in the long run. So making sure your staff know how to deal with disputes, when to escalate, and how you yourself will deal with some of the bigger disputes will help you minimize those disputes occurring. And I think now we can hand over to Nicole, who will tell you about some more practical tips about how you can develop your business.
Thanks, Astrid. And I think you touched on dispute resolution there, and we deal with a range of different consultants and stakeholders in the SIL space. And I was just recently, a few days ago, speaking to a consultant who works with SIL providers. And one of the providers was audited by the NDIS and was asked to back pay almost $300,000 in terms of over-claiming. So obviously, LegalVision will be there to try and assist clients in situations like those, but of course everyone wants to be avoiding those. So I start with the business needs, because essentially as a provider you are running a business, and while there are a lot of heart considerations, as I call them, there are some tougher considerations and business considerations that you need to put in place. So the first thing is, we wouldn't recommend going into SIL and offering SIL unless you really understand the quoting process, how to price SIL, and how to avoid under or over claiming. So there I put in brackets ROC, which stands for roster of care. If you're a SIL provider and you don't know what this means, or you're not using a roster of care, then I would be very, very concerned. So that's the first thing, is if you don't understand the quoting process, there are people and providers consultants who can help you understand that. Make sure you're getting good advice and you develop the skills in-house. The second observation we would make from working with a lot of SIL providers is that staff matters. Now, Astrid touched on the use of subcontractors, and we understand that this happens across various different parts of the NDIS. However, from our experience and from working with some of the best SIL providers in the space, they tell us, and we know, that hiring permanent staff makes all the difference versus hiring contractors. And one of the main reasons for that is that staff turnover is much lower if you are employing people on a permanent basis. Those staff members feel that they are part of a team. And that's really important when you're creating a harmonious home environment. The other important thing for providers to consider, and I'm very aware of the fact that we are touching on some very big topics, but the idea is to go back and assess whether or not you're addressing these properly. So the second issue around staff is training and support. So we mentioned that if you're supporting people in a SIL environment, it's highly likely that these clients have complex needs. Some of them might have positive behavior support plans in place, or you might have to deal with restrictive practices. So it's important that you are hiring the right staff, that you're training them, and that they feel supported. And then I put SHADs. So this is important from a business and financial sustainability point of view. When you're doing your roster of care and when you're creating your rosters, it's important to understand the cost implications and how the timing of your different shifts and the SHADs rates will impact your costs. So that's something to consider. Of course, a very important business consideration is to remember that you can only claim for the funded ratio. So when unexpected things happen, when a housemate moves out, when things that you haven't necessarily planned for in your roster happen, you can't necessarily change the way that you claim. So you need to, from a cash flow perspective, you need to manage this, and you need to be able to do this in an efficient way. So moving on to participant consideration. So one of the most important considerations is you need to be able to support SIL clients at any stage of their SIL journey. And the reason why I say this is because if you are offering SIL, you don't necessarily know at what stage in that journey clients might come to you. So many people who are attending this webinar ask the question, where do I find SIL clients? And the important part there is that you may be transitioning a client from another provider where they've been unhappy. So you need to be able to manage that transition. Or you may be bringing on a new SIL client who's coming out of a hospital, or they may be coming out of home. So those are all very different transitions, and you need to be able to manage that, as well as the person, take into account the person's goals and aspirations. So these are the softer aspects of SIL, but really critical, because if you are not able to help your clients feel safe and feel that they have their needs are being met, they won't stay with you. The other important aspect is, and we see this time and time again, and it came up in the own motion inquiry into supported accommodation, is that those providers that are highly responsive to clients' complaints or clients' requests and have good communications in place, those are the providers that are likely to have a high occupancy rate and who are able to deliver better outcomes for their participants, and it's likely that their clients will stay with them. And of course, it's important to assess from a risk perspective, both the physical risks, the physical environment, but also the processes that you need to put in place to support your clients' needs. Moving on to SIL houses. So one of the biggest challenges we see is where providers have multiple homes is just managing when people leave, and of course that creates complications. One of the key things here we'd say is engage with all stakeholders early. So when you have a new client that might be coming into a home, it's highly likely that that person has a number of people supporting them, whether it's their support coordinator, occupational therapist, other clinicians, GP, local area coordinator, parent, family, and it's important that you engage everyone in that process. Identify what your obligations are, and it's really important to stop and think, can I support this client? And before you rush into quoting, for example. Then another important aspect around SIL houses is the matching of clients and matching of housemates and participants. Now this is quite complex, and in talking to one of our great SIL providers at MyCareSpace and their CEO, he said to me that it is the most complex form of NDIS support SIL, and matching or getting the matching of participants wrong can have serious consequences for everyone, including the provider and the participant. And then some obvious things, but it's always important to state that, is establishing house rules, focusing on the harmonious environment is really important. And of course, building local networks. That is critical, and we know from Royal Commission and from the own motion inquiries, one of the key insights is that if the SIL provider doesn't have access to health experts and local networks, it's going to result in poorer outcomes for their clients. So very important to consider before you decide opening a SIL house in an area where you have no networks. Think again. Right, so that's business considerations. Astrid, any questions or observations?
I think, Nicole, we've had a question which I would not usually answer at the end, but I think we might answer now. that's asking what is a roster of care and how do you draft one? What is the purpose?
Yeah,
Do you,
yeah,
you give us more information on
yeah.
that?
So a roster of care is really the tool that's used by providers to quote when they have a new SIL client, someone approaches them and asks, are you able to support me? The roster of care is the tool, the quoting tool that is used by the provider to have a look at the ratio of supports that a person needs, and obviously over the course of a week, those needs of the person changes. So they might be in the SIL home for some of the day. They might need one-to-one care for certain parts of the day, 1 to 3 the rest of the day, or they might be, they might need active overnight. So these are all things that the provider needs a tool to help quote and actually work out what the cost is. It's important that that providers realize that each participant, each client needs a roster of care, or ROC. And if you don't know how to complete this, if you don't know how to manage these aspects, we can put you in touch with specialists who can support you in doing this, because it is complex and claiming is complex, and it's important that providers don't over claim. For example, when a housemate leaves, or underclaim, and then that results in them having a financial loss because they haven't understood the true cost of what they're delivering.
And am I right, Nicole? I don't know if you have seen this, but what we often see is that the provider is helping prepare the home and living form for the NDIS to the planning meeting. We have a roster of care, they submit it, but the NDIS does not fund the submitted amount, which then results in having to have the roster of care changed depending on the funded amount, not necessarily the requested amount. Is that
Yes.
something you see quite often as well?
Yes, and of course, providers have to consider and take into account things like holidays and irregular supports, and if they're not providing access to the community or community supports, this all needs to be factored in. And if someone is sick, what happens then? So yes, it's a dynamic tool, and it's certainly not static by any means. So it's very important that providers understand how to use this. Otherwise, it could have catastrophic consequences for them.
Thanks, Nicole. And we know now that the NDIS is looking very, very closely at SIL. We have had the Four Corners report, the Disability Commission, the own inquiry, and SIL has been flagged by the NDIS. That's something that they will be looking at closely, including SIL providers. Can you maybe tell us how to minimize their risk going forward? About
Yes.
What can providers put in place to help themselves?
So if we can move on to the next slide, we can touch on some of the risk aspects. So first of all, again, it's a very superficial, with 30 minutes of time, it's a very superficial sort of observation, key points that we're touching on. But we've mentioned this multiple times, and I'll say it again, SIL is probably the most complex form of NDIS support that you can be delivering, and a key, and if you don't get it right, the consequences can be catastrophic for your clients. And we know that the most important thing that we need to consider is the safety and safeguarding our clients in that SIL environment. So the first step is the risk assessment. So if you don't already have a risk assessment tool, you may consider developing your own bespoke one, or consider an off-the-shelf package, but it's critical that you have a risk assessment tool in place, and that the risk assessment is done upfront. To be able to do the risk assessment, you need to be collecting information from multiple sources. So whether it's the housing report from the OT, positive behavior support plan, other clinical reports, you need to ask for these, you need to collect all this information, you need to read it, and you need to make sure that you're not missing important information. Then, of course, if you do interpret all this information as your client being a high-risk participant, you may have a forum within your organization, which might be a clinical committee, who then assesses the risk profile of this client, and what steps are you going to take to prevent and minimize risk. So that's important. The second important thing is the onboarding process. So we've spoken about transitions, and remember, you may be transitioning a new client from any type of environment. It might be from their own home, parental home. It might be from a hospital environment where they've been very sick, dealing with complex health issues. So it's important that you involve all stakeholders in that transition and onboarding process. Of course, we mention again staff, so staff have to have the appropriate skills and training, and this is key to minimizing your risks. So identify what type of training your staff need, whether it's more sort of health related or behavioral related, and ensure that they get the training. The other very practical, and it might be obvious, but avoid long shifts. So when you're doing your rostering of your staff, you may think that you are being efficient by creating long shifts, but this only puts your staff at risk and your clients at risk. And of course, another very practical consideration that has implications for risk is give your staff tools. So give them digital tools or practical tools, which may be around incident management, that allow them to quickly report and elevate incident management to a higher level. We've already touched on accurate quoting. So this is from a business perspective, because if you are not quoting and if you're not rostering well, and if this might result in leakage or overcharging. And as I just mentioned, a client of one of our partners has now been asked to back pay $300,000. Nobody wants to find them in this position. And then just from a risk perspective, plan for the unexpected. So you are creating a home environment, and even in my own home environment, I say, expect a new surprise every day, and then you will be ready to deal with it. So I think that SIL and supported accommodation environment is exactly the same. So whether it's illness, holidays, staff not being available, you need to factor this in. From an insurance perspective, it's quite black and white. So we know that as a minimum, to be registered as an NDIS provider, and I understand that not all SIL providers need to be registered. However, this would be the minimum we would accept at MyCareSpace, is that all the providers need to at least have professional indemnity in place, public liability. So the two, sometimes you can get a combined policy. And MyCareSpace actually has an insurance partnership, so we can help you find very competitive insurance for all these insurances. So professional indemnity, public liability, and then accident insurance. So typically accident insurance is your workers' compensation insurance, and that would be on a state-based basis. So if you've got SIL in multiple homes, you'd be registering with your individual state-based workers' comp insurance. And then something which is not necessarily mandated by the NDIS Commission, or something that we see as critical, and you touched on this, Astrid, is also cyber insurance. And this is because we're all working with personal identifiable information. But not only that, we're especially as a SIL provider, you're collecting very sensitive personal information. Now, if there should be a cyber attack, or if you're hacked and that information is lost, there'll be consequences for you, but there'll also be consequences for your clients. And it's important that you have the appropriate cyber insurance in place. And then, as an observation, often when providers acquire cyber insurance, there's a questionnaire they have to follow out, and it's at that point they might realize how exposed they are. So it's really critical. And then of course you need to be aware of what are the premium drivers for your insurance. So you need to be able to afford the insurance, and if the higher the risk of your clients, this might drive higher insurance premiums. So consider what processes do you have in place to manage that from a risk perspective.
Thanks, Nicole. I might add a couple of things from my legal opinion for risk. Making sure that you know who's supporting the participant. Is the Office of Public Guardian involved? Is there a plan nominee? Do you have a power of attorney? Who is responsible to sign the agreement? Because if your agreement is signed by someone who does not control the funds, so who is not the plan nominee, or someone who, if you have a guardianship order in place, but the agreement is not signed by the guardian, you cannot enforce your agreement. So knowing who's around the participant is really important. Having in place policies and procedures before it gets to issues like we've already touched on, but that means like making sure you have the informed consent. Because if you do not have the informed consent, you cannot discuss the participant with the plan manager, the support coordinator, or other family members. That you have all those documents prepared, ready to go. That you are aware of any medical conditions, of anything that's degenerative, that the participant could get worse. Are you going to have to transition them to an SDA? Will you have to change the roster, do a change of circumstance? Knowing who to speak to if a change of circumstance is necessary. All those things are required to minimize your risk of issues happening. Next slide,
Sure,
please.
and that emphasizes, I think, the importance of not just considering the physical environment and you know, actually having the home with all its accommodations in place, or you know, if there's any modifications that need to be made, that's just the start. If the provider doesn't have, as you say, all the paperwork in place, again, this could have dire consequences, not only for the provider, for their staff, and for clients. So we can move on to, I think, the next slide, just conscious of time.
Just go through this very quickly because we are running out of time to answer any questions you may have at the end. Just wanted to touch base on your reporting obligations. There are a number of mandatory reporting obligations under the NDIS, and you have to make sure that your staff are aware of what those obligations are and that you have a process in place to make the report. In addition to the NDIS reporting obligations, you may also have state-specific requirements if it relates to the abuse of children and sometimes elder abuse. So seeking advice on what you need to report, how you need to report it, and when you need to report it is very important. I'm going to touch very briefly on restrictive practices. We have seen a very, very big uptick in the past few weeks since the Four Corners report and the NDIS Commission issuing breach notices, either for restrictive practices that were written in a plan or those that were unauthorized. You need to make sure your staff are trained in what a restrictive practice is, that you do not employ any restrictive practices in a SIL house unless it's written in a PBSP, and in the rare circumstance that you have to do a restrictive practice, that you do report it to the Commission. And in terms of that, it's just making sure that if you are registered, that you need to comply with the regulatory requirements at the NDIS and the state level. That is in relation to reporting, and in some states you actually have to register twice if you are implementing a restrictive practice, as well as seeking approval for the restrictive practice. And some states actually have legislation that is separate to the NDIS in terms of what is a restrictive practice, and that includes things like locks on windows and locks on doors and that sort of thing, which would be quite relevant to a SIL house. I think we'll wrap up now, and Nicole will just summarize from what we discussed today, what in her opinion makes a successful SIL provider.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Astrid, and certainly we have a team at MyCareSpace that works with providers and that onboards providers, and so we've seen a lot of different types of providers, but certainly the things that we look for and we know will indicate that providers are committed to providing a high quality service is those that understand that they have to balance their legal obligations with the client's aspirations and goals, and also taking into account their staff. It's a real partnership. It's a real home that you're creating. And so you've got to have the soft things in place as well as the tougher, more compliance related things in place. So probably the most important thing after that is then clearly considering your client's rights, preferences, and choices. A lot of times we see complaints that people don't feel that they have had choice, they don't feel that their rights have been observed, and we've seen this documented in many of the reports the NDIS have issued on SIL. So this is important. If you are a SIL provider, this needs to be front and center of everything that you do and part of your culture. The other important thing is focus on your workforce capability, not only their attitude, but also the aptitude. And And this has to come from the top down, and we do talk about strong governance, but it needs to be part of your culture. So culture of training, best practice. This will involve routine training, but also routine supervision, and please make sure that you're investing in this, because it will pay off. Then strong mainstream connections. Your clients will need to be connected to informal supports, and it's likely that it will at some point involve health, connecting to the health community, and lots of other mainstream supports. So make sure that you have strong connections. We've spoken about governance. So if you are delivering SIL, make sure that the board understands what the risks are, and that where there are incidents, these are being reported to the board, and that they have an outcome focus, so that they can minimize the incidents and minimize risk. And then, of course, this ties in with having effective incident complaints processes and prevention focus. So if you're doing all of those, that's a good start. And then on the other side, it requires investment in all the things that we've mentioned there. Probably one of the things from a business perspective that is worth noting is it's hard to deliver this on your own. So you will need a team that will help you build your SIL service, and from observing the length of time it takes between when you first start talking to a potential customer, to when you actually get the person in the home, it can take between 6 to 12 months. So your business needs to be able to support this process, and it can be lengthy, but if you do it properly, then you will get good outcomes, both from a business perspective and from a client perspective. So that's really it from me, Astrid.
Thanks, Nicole. I think now I might take some questions. And there's a few questions that have come into the chat today, as well as those that were submitted prior to today. Is it mandatory to register as a boarding house? It's not a simple yes or no. It depends on what state you're in and the number of people in the house. We're more than happy to help. So if you wanted to book with us, I'll be able to talk you through whether this is something you need to do. Do staff under shares get paid for training? I'm not an employment lawyer, but we do have an employment team, and we will be going through that. They can go through that with you. However, my understanding is yes, generally, if your staff member is working, they need to get paid.
I'm guessing, Astrid, they might be working, but you might not be able to claim for that time. And
right.
You know, again, just talking to different people in the industry, there's anecdotal sort of examples of where they say, well, the provider had 2 staff members in the SIL house. No one else was in the house, but they had two staff members on duty. So yes, you might be paying the staff, but it doesn't mean that you can claim. So that's important, I think, to make that distinction.
Very important, Nicole. And we do have a question that maybe you would want to address. Is like, how do you know that the provider is a dodgy provider?
Yeah, well, I think that's an excellent question, and something that obviously, you know, support coordinators and families and individuals come to us and look for the support in this area. And I think it's having those conversations that we have with providers up front before they are onboarded at MyCareSpace, and trying to understand if they have thought through their obligations, if they are aware of their obligations. Do they have the basic processes in place? Do they have insurances in place? Or are they just focusing on the dollar outcomes? And I think that often requires human conversations, human intervention, you know. So I would say that you need to meet with the SIL provider. You need to express your preferences, your goals, your aspirations. See how the provider interprets that. See how well the provider listens. And if red flags are being raised at that point, I would start looking elsewhere. So Yeah, I mean, that is the question that we can help people consider, and I'd encourage anyone looking for SIL to come to MyCareSpace, speak to our connections team. They're very experienced, and we can put you in touch with providers who are experienced in delivering a quality SIL service.
Got a number of other questions coming in. While I wait for those to flash up on my screen, you can see that we have a free download that you can scan the QR code and access our NDIS service agreements fact sheet. We also have an upcoming event on how founders can succeed in the startup ecosystem, which will be held on Thursday, 30th November, and you can register using the link on the slide. We also have to can tell you about our LegalVision membership, which is cost effective and like having your own in-house counsel. We can take care of your business as usual legal work. You can focus on running your business. Through our monthly fee, which provides cost certainty. So apart from our disputes work, you know exactly that you get all your legal work covered for a flat fee per month, which is quite unlike traditional legal firms that will charge you hourly rates for any question that you may have. Whereas with us, you can just call us and we will answer your question under your monthly fee. In relation to how we help our NDIS clients, we can help our NDIS clients with all their employment work, their brand protection, franchising if required, setting up all their service agreements, privacy policies, privacy advice, health record advice, subcontracting agreements. And Nicole from MyCareSpace can help you with all your business development needs. And we have a number of questions that have come in now about how do you find clients? How do you find participants for your SIL house? And Nicole is the person to help you with this. We also have a couple of additional questions about, does a person have to have SIL funding to live in a SIL home? Short answer, no. You can use CORE. It becomes a bit more difficult in terms of claiming. It becomes a bit more difficult in terms of risk, but there are certainly participants who have a fair amount of CORE in daily activities or social and community who do use that to pay for SIL. We have a question about what do you do for rent? Well, generally speaking, as I said at the start, rent should be charged separately. It's not covered by the NDIS and it should not be part of how you claim. A lot of providers use the same formula that we do in SDA, which is 25% DSP plus 100% rent assistance. And that would be recorded in a separate agreement. It is quite important if you ever get audited that it doesn't look like that you're still home and you're using the NDIS funding to offset the cost of rent, utilities, and food, which is again why we recommend having two agreements.
And Astrid, I'll just jump in there and say, you know, if you are considering offering SIL, get in touch with us. We do have some resources, so that QR code there will help you connect with some of the resources. And then, of course, finding clients is something that a lot of smaller SIL providers and bigger ones struggle with. So it's something that we can talk through with you. MyCareSpace has multiple different types of subscriptions and services where we can help you connect with clients. So yeah, we'd love to talk to you. And I think, you know, it's important to realize that this is not a quick process. So you need to be patient, and like we said, it can take between 6 to 12 months.
Also have a question about whether unregistered providers can provide SIL. This is yes and no. There's nothing preventing you from providing SIL as in a SIL home, but generally speaking, SIL is an agency managed support, which means de facto you have to be registered. So even though you don't have to, in practice you do. Unless you're using CORE, which is self-managed to fund a SIL, which is a different story. And out of time, I might take the last question that's come in, which is, my landlord doesn't know I'm putting a participant in a SIL house. Is that an issue? That could potentially be a big issue because you're effectively running a business into a residential house. To be able to answer your question definitively, we'd have to look at the lease you have with your landlord and whether there's anything preventing you from doing that and what rights you may or may not have under the relevant statements. think this is it. Nicole, if you have nothing you would like to add.
No, just thank you. It's been great working with LegalVision. We are a LegalVision client ourselves, and we'd highly recommend taking up this complimentary consultation. And yeah, it's been a pleasure working with you. So thanks, Astrid, for today.
Thanks, Nicole. It was equally my pleasure to work with you. And again, feel free to contact MyCareSpace. That's all. So now, if you want to submit your details in the survey at the end, if we haven't answered your questions, you can then book in with our complimentary legal consult, and we will be able to do our best to answer any questions that you may have. If you can also take the time to give us some feedback as a 30-second survey at the end, and we'll be greatly appreciative if you do have the time to fill this out for us. So again, thank you for joining us, and feel free to get in touch with myself or Nicole, and we'll be able to help you with your SIL living needs. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.